You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Professor Allen Guelzo. If you recognize that name, it's because he did appear on the Leaders and Legends podcast last year to discuss his new biography on Robert E. Lee. I've been a fan of his since I used to read his articles in the National Review back in the day. Professor Guelzo, I'm not going to read his entire CV because it would take up all of our time, but he is currently the Thomas W. Smith Distinguished Research Scholar in the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University, where he teaches courses on Lincoln, the Civil War era Constitution, and American intellectual history. He is the author of 15 books on Lincoln, the Civil War, and American culture. I do enjoy Abraham Lincoln, Redeemer President, Dr. Guelzo. He is a 3-time winner of the Lincoln Prize and the very prestigious Lincoln Prize, and the winner of the inaugural Guggenheim Lehrman Military History Prize in 2013 for his New York Times bestseller, Gettysburg, The Last Invasion. Professor Guelzo, thank you for coming back on the podcast.
Very good to be back.
Can we argue about Gettysburg for 2 minutes before the podcast ends?
Sure. Open fire.
We are discussing the professor's new book, Our Ancient Faith, Lincoln, Democracy, and the American Experiment, which I'm going to read this because it involves I've already read this book, but the blurb on the back I'm going to read because it involves another podcast guest of ours, and that is George F. Will. Quote, "It is altogether fitting and proper that with this meditation on democracy and its most subtle defender, Allen Guelzo again demonstrates that he is today's most profound interpreter of this nation's history and significance." High praise from a brilliant man.
Better than I deserve.
How did you find you've written these books, there's always these books about Lincoln and Shakespeare and Jesus and Napoleon and all these huge figures. And it's, what else can you do? What else can you find? But as we were talking before we started the podcast, you said it's not that hard to find new stuff.
No, I don't think that it is. Granted, yes, Lincoln has been written about probably more than any other single individual in American history. And there are piles and piles of Lincoln books, or at least books with Lincoln in the title. If you go across the street from Ford's Theater to Ford's Education Center, when you walk in the front door, you'll see this enormous spiral going up 4 floors in the Education Center. It's a spiral composed entirely of Lincoln books. And that makes the whole notion of writing about Lincoln, studying Lincoln, seem so forbidding. And yet, you have to bear 2 things in mind. One is that a great deal of what is written about Lincoln tends to be the same stuff over and over again. The Lincoln field is what I would sometimes compare to a very broad, rich meadow. And across that meadow is one track. You've got two ruts made by the wagon wheels on that track. And the ruts are very deep because the wagons that have passed across that meadow have simply gone in the same ruts over and over again. All around are untouched parts of that meadow. That is what the Lincoln field is like. Now, how do you lay hands then? How do you recognize what are these other parts of the field you can pay attention to? In 1930, James Garfield Randall, who was the first academic Lincoln biographer, gave a lecture to the American Historical Association entitled, "Has the Lincoln Theme Been Exhausted?" In other words, they were asking that question in 1930. And James Garfield Randall's response was, first of all, no, it has not been exhausted. Don't be deceived. And then he laid out about a dozen new lines of inquiry and interpretation of Abraham Lincoln. Amazingly, very few of them have been explored. Those challenges he laid down have by and large not been taken up. So that even after almost a century since Randall's lecture, we have had specific directions pointed out to us of new initiatives in interpreting Abraham Lincoln, but people have not picked up on them. Instead, they've gone in the ruts. So what I've tried to do, at least in the work that I've done, is to get out of the ruts, to do something different. And I would encourage other people who are interested in studying Lincoln to look at what Randall suggested, the themes he believed would open up new ways of looking at and interpreting Lincoln, and explore some of those. Because what you'll find is you're not just doing what everyone else has done. You'll be doing something new, something interesting, and something novel. Go back to Randall and look at the directions Randall was recommending. There is yet a lot of work to be done on the figure of Abraham Lincoln.
Does the topic or the particular emphasis of a book on Lincoln, how much of that is dictated by the fact that you have to sell books?
Probably less than it seems. Most people who set out to study Lincoln and to write about Lincoln are doing it because of Lincoln. No, probably yes. There are some people who are, shall we say, in it for hitting the jackpot. And that's going to be the case in almost anything. What is, I think, really surprising and, in fact, heartening is how many people are attracted to Lincoln simply because of the attractiveness and the interest of the man himself as a subject. I've been involved in several different, shall we call them, fraternities of historical research. And some of them, I have to say, have been about as welcoming as an ice cave. You've got people, they're doing their little thing on this particular subject, and they don't really want anyone to come in and offer any kind of competition. I had ambitions many years ago to write a biography of another famous American. And when I broached this subject to someone who was more or less in the same, that person's response was, "Oh, no, you won't. I'm going to write that book," which that person did. All right, I'm not condemning someone who wants to make sure that the book they're going to write is regarded as the best in its field. And it did turn out to be a very good book. But the Lincoln field has turned out to be a very different affair. The people that I have come to know in what I sometimes call the Lincoln fraternity, it's a very different atmosphere. You're welcomed with open arms and open hands. People sit down and share research material with you. I've sat down, for instance, and you mentioned earlier Michael Burlingame having been on this series. I can remember occasions, in fact, I still have occasions back and forth by email with Michael, that we find something new in an archive somewhere. First thing we sit down and do is we write to each other and say, "Have you seen this?" It's not I'm going to keep that to myself because I want the credit for it. It is as though some measure of Lincoln's own generosity and humility of spirit has been imparted in some mysterious way to the people who are the students of Lincoln. And it has been quite a wonderful experience. to be part of that Lincoln fraternity.
Like Lincoln himself would be upset, and if two of his biographers or scholars were squabbling over him, he personally would tell some joke and story and say, "Get along." Sorry, I can't hear you. Can you hear me?
Are you back on?
Yes.
All
Now I
right.
can
I
hear
don't
you.
know what interfered there.
The deep.
I don't know.
Well, let me ask the question again.
Some gremlin elbowed their way in. Maybe it was the unhappy spirit of John Wilkes Booth,
or Chase,
or something like that. Yeah, even Salmon Chase might.
Let me ask you the question again, and we'll just make a quick edit.
Okay.
Would you say it's almost like the spirit of Abraham Lincoln, that he himself would have knocked a couple of historians' heads together or made a joke and said, "Hey, let's all get along and let's talk and let's teach"?
Lincoln was a man who had, among several saving graces, the saving grace of not taking himself seriously. He said on several occasions things that are really worth remembering for one's own personal conduct. In July of 1862, he responded to a letter he'd received from a man named Cuthbert Bullitt in Louisiana. Bullitt was a Southern Unionist, and there were parts of Louisiana that had now been reoccupied by Union forces, and there was a good deal of back and forth between the Union military occupation and those who were, in fact, Southern Unionists who thought they should be allowed to call their own shots. And Bullitt gets frustrated enough with this that he writes to Lincoln and complains, "Your generals are doing this, your generals are doing that. They're making a mess of things here in Louisiana." And Lincoln writes back to Bullitt and he says two things. One is, first of all, he says, "Look, you people in Louisiana caused this trouble. You brought it down on yourselves. Don't come complaining to me." But the second thing he says, and this is how he closes his letter, "I shall do nothing in malice. What we are dealing with is too great for malicious dealing." And I think that's a simply remarkable statement. He wasn't going to put himself out front. He wasn't going to take personal offense. He realized that the cause that he was giving leadership to was much more important in and of itself than he was. There's another incident, too, and this occurs in 1863. Lincoln had a very lively interest in theater. And, of course, being in a theater is what brings his life to a close. But in the theater, what he loved above all was Shakespeare. He could recite chunks of Shakespeare off by heart. A noted Shakespearean of the day, James Hackett, was invited by Lincoln to come and give what we would call today a private command performance at the White House of Shakespearean examples. And Lincoln afterwards wrote to him and talked about his interest in Shakespeare and how he hadn't read all of Shakespeare's plays, but there were some of them he'd read over as many times as any professional actor. And he had a few suggestions. "I think this is the way this ought to be said in Henry IV, Part 2, or something like that." Hackett was so enthused at getting this letter from the President of the United States that unfortunately he leaked it to the press. And the press then turned around and said, "What is the President of the United States doing, wasting the time and the money of the Republic on actors and Shakespeare?" Hackett was so embarrassed. He wrote to apologize to Lincoln. And Lincoln wrote back to him and said, effectively, "Don't worry about it. I've had much ridicule, not entirely separate from kindness. And I have had much kindness, not entirely separated from ridicule." I'm not quoting that entirely accurately. But in that letter to Hackett, what he's saying is, I've encountered so much of this before. It doesn't bother me. And he ended the note by saying to Hackett, "I am used to it." He was a man with a lot of resilience. He could absorb tremendous amounts of punishment. And when you encounter a historical figure like that, when you encounter someone who is as important as he is at the moment in the past, 160 years ago, that is a genuinely remarkable quality. I'll give you one more example that way. Also from 1863. This is July of 1863. Ulysses Grant has just completed the capture of Vicksburg, Mississippi. And about 2 weeks after the fall of Vicksburg to Grant, Lincoln writes him a letter, and he says,
this is my favorite. Forgive me, Doctor. This is my favorite letter of the war.
all right,
Absolute favorite. Please go ahead. It's absolutely brilliant.
Lincoln writes to Grant, and he says, when you started out on this campaign, I had my doubts. I didn't think it was going to end well. And when you got across the river, I was very anxious that you were somehow going to be isolated and picked off. On the other hand, look what happened. You defeated the Confederate forces, you laid siege to Vicksburg, and they surrendered to you. And I'm writing to you now to say to you, you were right and I was wrong. I think.
Yeah.
When is the last time you heard a president say something like that?
To offer my personal acknowledgement that you were right and I was wrong.
Exactly.
So what did he say to McClellan or about McClellan? When McClellan treated him so poorly in 1962, I would gladly hold his hat.
I would hold his horse if he would only give us victories. Lincoln is saying, this is not about me. This is not about the first person singular. Someone once said about Lincoln that Lincoln never, this was a comment that was made by Josiah Gilbert Holland, who later becomes a Lincoln biographer, some note. And Holland said, I don't think that Lincoln ever thought of himself as president. He thought of himself as the attorney general of the people. He was representing the people's interests. It wasn't about him. And what he saw in the American democracy was of infinitely greater importance than Abraham Lincoln.
We are talking with Professor Allen Guelzo of his new book, Our Ancient Faith, Lincoln, Democracy, and the American Experiment. Now, I've talked to enough authors on the Leaders and Legends podcast to know that plenty of thought goes into the title of his or her book. Why is this titled Our Ancient Faith? It's
a phrase that Lincoln uses in the great speech he gives in Peoria, Illinois, on October 16th, 1854. It's one of a series of speeches he gives, which is something of his re-entry into active political life. He had been involved in politics in Illinois and at other levels for almost all of his career until he is elected finally to the House of Representatives in 1847. But that solitary term that he serves in the United States Congress is in many ways something of a downer for him. First of all, his party is not fully in control of what's going on with President James Knox Polk and the Mexican War. So he delivers speeches attacking Polk. What do people do? They interpret that as a slur on the soldiers who are fighting the war that Polk has begun. So even when Lincoln makes motions toward perhaps a second term, it's made very clear, no, we're not letting you run again. The Whig Party in Illinois lays that down very clearly for Lincoln. And this is largely because back home in Illinois, there was a lot of criticism for Lincoln's criticism of President Polk. So Lincoln comes back to Illinois after that solitary term in Congress. And as he said himself on several occasions, he decided to put politics on the back burner. He was going to concentrate on his law practice. His family was growing up. And he seemed almost to have lost some of his fire for politics. And then in 1854 comes the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act is a game changer in American politics. Because effectively what it does, through the doctrine of popular sovereignty, it makes it possible for slavery to become legalized in all of the Western territories. And Lincoln's fear is that once you do that, then the political balance of the future shifts towards slavery. And sooner or later, that political balance will weigh against the free states and slavery will become legalized throughout the country. Up to that moment, Lincoln had believed that slavery was an antique from ancient centuries and it was on its way out, and all we had to do was to just gradually push it along and it would go of its own force. Kansas-Nebraska showed him he was dead wrong. All the power, all the initiative for slavery was in fact gaining strength And Kansas, Nebraska was going to open the door for that strength to dominate American life. So he comes back into the world of politics. And he does it with this series of speeches in Illinois in 1854. And the apex of it is the speech he gives at Peoria in October of 1854. That speech, I've often said, if everything else that Lincoln had said and written that's come down to us was somehow erased, and all you had left was the Peoria speech, that would be enough to give you all of Lincoln's political philosophy. Because in it, he lays out how utterly contradictory slavery and the growth of slavery is with the basic assumptions and principles of the American democracy as they've been built up since the Declaration of Independence. And at that point, he makes this very emotional appeal. He says, my ancient faith dictates something entirely different from slavery. And then a paragraph or two later, he changes the pronoun. It becomes our ancient faith, which is captured by the Declaration of Independence, the declaration that all men are created equal. And that, he says, leads us to another aspect of the Declaration, the consent of the governed. And that, he says in this speech, is the sheet anchor of American republicanism. So he's laying out, under the umbrella of this phrase, our ancient faith, what he believes Americans have always had to believe, what Americans always must believe, what is the bedrock of the American democracy. That, he says, that is our ancient faith. Hence the title of the book.
We all know that Lincoln was a lover of history, especially how much he loved the Bible, which you talk about in your book. When you use the word ancient on Lincoln's behalf, the word that he used, how far back do you go when you're trying to construct a litany of Lincoln's influences?
It's curious, when he talks about an ancient faith, he doesn't talk about Athens and the Golden Age. He doesn't even try to talk about the Roman Republic. For him, this ancient faith was born in 1776. That may not strike us as terribly ancient. So it's worth asking, why would he use a word like ancient? Why doesn't he say something like, this is our traditional faith, or this is the faith we've been following for the last, 70-some years? I mean, he does say something somewhat like that at Gettysburg in November of 1863. He says, 7 years ago, not our ancient faith. So the word ancient strikes us as a little strange. Two things I think have to get borne in mind. One is there's a certain Lincoln is not a historian. He's not a scholar. So he is going to talk about an ancient faith because for him, ancient is something which exists before the immediate experience of people alive then. In fact, sufficiently far back in that experience that it really does seem ancient, that it might as well be Athens and the Golden Age. Now, we might say, wait a minute, it really wasn't that long. But look at the ways in which he talks about, let's call it ancientness. In the Lyceum speech of 1838, his first major political utterance in public that's well received and well documented. In the Lyceum speech, he speaks there about people who don't have any connection anymore to the American Revolution. He says, the Revolution laid out the fundamentals of the American Republic. That's true, but the silent artillery of time, that's the phrase he uses, the silent artillery of time has worn all that away. And we no longer have very much in the way of living testimonies of the revolution around us. So what is going to help build up and perpetuate our political institutions? His answer is reverence for the law. Reverence for the law is what we have to cultivate in every place and in every household. And reverence for the law is what's going to continue. It's going to sustain that faith. If we don't have an immediate contact with it, only law can do that. He's actually talking about what he means in 1854 by something being ancient. It's out of our immediate experience. He'll do the same thing in 1858 when he speaks in Chicago at the very beginning of the Lincoln-Douglas campaign. And once again, he'll say, fully half the people of this country have come from someplace else. They don't have any immediate contact. Grandpa didn't suffer through the snows of Valley Forge with General Washington. No, they came from, as he puts it, Scandinavia, Germany, France. They came from other places. Fully half the country. They don't have any living connection. They don't have any genealogical association. They're not sons of the American Revolution. What then connects them to the principles of the revolution? He says, when they read in that declaration that all men are created equal, then they feel that they are flesh of the flesh and bone of the bone of those old men that wrote the Declaration. And so they are, because that is the electric cord that runs through every lover of liberty. The immediate experience of the revolution, it is ancient. It is far in the distance. What makes the principles of the American Revolution live for us is that when we hear them, when we recognize them, we at once recognize something which is true and fundamental and natural. And this is what Jefferson talks about when he talks about how self-evident it is that we're all equipped with these natural rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So he can talk about ancientness, and it can mean it in the sense that it's far enough in the past that we might, in fact, be losing touch with it. But principles, if we can readopt the principles, as he says again in the Peoria speech, if we can wash our robes white in the blood of the revolution, then we can grasp those principles just as if they were newly hatched in our own time, despite the fact that they might be chronologically ancient.
Is this what I'm a huge fan of Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address? So is this what he's reaching back for when he uses phrases like mystic chords of memory, and he's trying to get the Americans to become, his fellow Americans to become one again? Like, we've all shared, we've all fought in this great experiment, and we all can prosper. Let's just figure this out somehow, some way. To me, the pleadings of the first inaugural address are inspiring, yet there's like heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm. Especially in that final paragraph of the first inaugural. Much of the first inaugural is a very lawyerly exploration of the follies of what is being committed by the seceding states. At that point, when he delivers the first inaugural, 7 states have seceded from the Union. It's eventually going to be 11, but 7 have seceded. And he spends much of his time simply saying, this is not a possibility. Constitutionally, legally, this is folly. In fact, what we're doing is we're not promoting something which is democratic. We're promoting anarchy through the idea of secession. It's when he comes to the end that he turns and makes this dramatic appeal. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. We must hear those mystic chords of memory. And I think that you're right. It is tied to this notion of an ancient faith. And what he wants us to do at the end of the first inaugural is to remember that ancient faith, to reappropriate it. And if we do, then we can put by passion. We can be governed by reason. And the future will, in fact, be a future of union and prosperity. That is a plea, of course, which the Confederate government had already organized itself to ignore. And so we had a war.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our guest today is Professor Allen Guelzo. We are discussing his new book, Our Ancient Faith, Lincoln, Democracy, and the American Experiment. To the extent that Lincoln thought he was protecting, promoting democracy, who did he think was undermining it and poisoning it?
For one thing, it was the secessionists. Now, granted, he convinces himself that the secessionists are really a group of hijackers. that there really is no huge groundswell in the South for secession. It is, and the South has become a plantation oligarchy. And these oligarchs have stolen democracy away from the people of the South. And the ultimate theft is when they want to go off on their own and set up their own Confederate States of America. I think there's some serious doubt as to whether Lincoln was reading public opinion quite accurately then. Of course, there were no polls to tell him otherwise at that point, but he's going by instinct. And his instinct tells him, people in the South, by and large, the rank and file of the Southern population, really are loyal to the Union. They will respond to an appeal to those mystic chords of memory. They don't. They don't. He then regards the leadership of the Confederacy as having perpetrated not secession, but revolution. Now, you might take a step back and say, what's the difference? Didn't we secede from Great Britain in 1770? The Confederates were just doing the same thing. And the answer I'd give to that is no, in fact, it's very different. A revolution is about discontinuity. You don't just walk away from something. You walk away from the entire idea, the principle, the practice of it. And that's what we did in the revolution. We didn't just decide we didn't want to be part of the British Empire anymore and goodbye, we'll be in touch later on. Oh, no. In the American Revolution, we not only detached ourselves from the British Empire, we got rid of the whole idea of monarchy. We got rid of British ways of doing things. We threw tea into Boston Harbor. We went, and in fact, we wanted to set aside even the tradition of English common law. Now, what we do, in effect, is we actually Americanize it. But we have discontinuity. We are doing something entirely different. And one of the national mottos, Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order in the ages. We really meant that. The American experiment was intended to do something different from anything Britain had done, and anything even more so than what Europeans had done. Now, secession. Secession's a very different affair. Secession is about continuity. Secession is where, for a variety of reasons, one group within a larger whole decides that things are not working out. We speak a different language, we have a different religion, we have a different culture, and we don't disagree, we have no grudges, but it really would be a whole lot better if we just went a separate way. And the example of that is Belgium in 1830, and then later on, the division of Sweden and Norway in 1906. And these were peaceful, these were amicable, and they were about continuity. Belgium detaches itself from the Netherlands, but it remains a monarchy. Sweden and Norway, again, same thing. They detach themselves, but they both remain monarchies. Secession is about a peaceful resolution. Now, you might say that a peaceful resolution would really be a nifty idea, but there's only one legal problem with what was going on in 1861, and that is the Constitution provides no mechanism for peaceful, continuous secession. It's just not there. You would think, if you were going to regard the Constitution as a contract between sovereign states, contracts, anyone who's had a course on contract in law school knows that in a contract, you not only start something, but you also have to have provisions for ending it. The contract has to say, this is what will happen when this particular arrangement, partnership, or business ends. And above all, you've got a reversion clause, which will say, this is how we're going to divide the proceeds and what this particular business or corporation owns. There's nothing like that in the Constitution. There's not a whisper of it. There is no provision in the Constitution for any kind of peaceful, continuous separation of the pieces of the United States, the separate states. No, it's just not there. There is no such provision. Why? Because the Constitution understood that it was permanent, that you could destroy the Constitution, but you could not dismember it. So Lincoln says, no, I'm sorry. What you're doing is not secession because there is no provision for secession. Now, Lincoln says, if you want to have a revolution where everything is discontinuous, oh, now that's different. Every people have a right, a revolutionary right, to set things up on their own. Now, you might wonder, all right, why didn't the Confederates simply say, okay, have it your way, Mr. Lincoln. What we're doing is not a secession. What we're doing is a revolution. Can we now do what we want to do? Confederates don't want to do that. Why don't the Confederates want to call what they're doing a revolution? Discontinuity. And the discontinuity is wrapped up with their slaves. Because the discontinuity that you have in a revolution means that all bets are off. All connections are off. The past no longer has any control over the present. And if you do that, then the laws governing slavery in the slave states go out the window. None of the people in the Confederacy wanted to see that happen. That's why they want to call what they're doing a secession, because they want to pretend that it's continuous. Lincoln lays out in the first inaugural, and then also in the special session speech he gives on July 4th, 1861, why this is impossible. He says to them, what you're doing, call it a revolution. Make this honest, knowing full well that they're not going to want to call it that because they don't want to take the chances in law.
I remember, and you correct me, please, in the Ken Burns series, Shelby Foote makes the comment, I'm pretty sure it's him, that one of the causes of the Civil War was our failure to do what I think he called, we have a genius for compromise, and we couldn't compromise. We couldn't figure it out. What was Lincoln's views on the Crittenden compromises? Obviously, I think the biggest or the most well-known one, but the compromises that you make in a democracy, how did he feel about those compromises as it related to slavery and keeping the Southern states in the Union? What did he say at one point? If the tug has to come, it may as well come now, or something like that?
Yes, if the tug has to come. Lincoln approved of a number of the great compromises. He approved of the Missouri Compromise. After all, it had been legislated into statute. If he is going to be someone who is encouraging people to exercise reverence toward the law, the Missouri Compromise was an item of law, so he respects that. The Compromise of 1850, likewise. But for Lincoln, there is a line that can't be crossed. And the line is, you take slavery and legalization of slavery into the territories. When that happens, then you have crossed his line of no return. And he looks at that and he says, this means the end of the American Republic. And on that ground, he says, we have to fight this because we believe that slavery is wrong. Slaveholders believe it is right, but we believe that slavery is wrong. And our believing it wrong and their believing it, that's really the only disagreement we have. Lincoln insisted over and over again, even in the first inaugural, that he had no intention of meddling with slavery in the states where it was legal. Not only did he have no intention, what he didn't say, but what was obvious was he had no power. Slavery was legal in those states by state enactments. As president of the United States, he couldn't reach over the firewall between state and federal jurisdictions and then simply free slaves in those states. He knew he couldn't do that. And he says to the Southerners, you know I can't do that. I can't do it. I don't have an intention of doing it. But what I do have an intention of doing is keeping slavery from expanding. Now, you might think, doesn't that sound perfectly reasonable? He's promising to leave them alone. They wanted something else. They wanted control. They wanted power. They wanted expansion. They were not going to be happy with anything less than that. That was what led to secession. Lincoln feels he has to oppose that. He's willing to compromise. In fact, right up until almost the end of the war, when he meets with 3 Confederate commissioners at Hampton Roads in February of 1865, even then he's still willing. Can we talk about compromise to get this war ended and the bloodshed stopped? Now, by that point, he's saying, look, slavery is now off the table. Sorry, I've issued the Emancipation Proclamation. I'm not retracting it. We've just seen the passage in Congress of the legislation that is the 13th Amendment. So slavery is no longer a subject of compromise. But he's willing to say, maybe the means by which we implement the abolition of slavery in the South, maybe that is amenable to compromise. He's willing to do it. They're not willing to do it. They're not willing to make that concession. And since they're not willing to make that concession, that's as far as things can go.
May I make a strained analogy, Professor?
Sure, go ahead.
To me, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Lincoln deciding that he's got to do something, is somewhat comparable, or it reminds me of Lincoln's determination for black vote, black citizenship, driving John Wilkes Booth to say, all right, I have to do something.
I'm going to put him through.
Mm-hmm. It'll be the last speech he'll ever make.
Right.
Are these, but the bigger point is these huge events, these things that completely change the conversation. Like you were talking about earlier with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, everything was floating around. That hits, it changes so much, makes Stephen A. Douglas, the senator from Illinois, this national figure, or reinforces the fact that he's a national figure. Booth is this fine actor, but has other issues, obviously, and he's mad about it, and he wants to kidnap and all this stuff in Lincoln. But the idea of blacks being, or the former slaves being, citizens and being able to vote catalyzes his action.
Back in 1858, and on the subject of race that way, I actually devote 2 chapters of this book, which is not a long book. It's 171 pages. All right, yes, it's another 150 pages of footnotes, but
it is another 150 pages of footnotes.
I don't want someone saying, by what authority does he say this? I want the notes there to say, okay, this is the authority on which I'm saying this. But I actually devote 2 chapters out of the 10 chapters of the book, 2 questions about Lincoln and race. And on the one hand, it's very easy, and I've met very many people who have done this. They have gone to something like what Lincoln says at the opening of the 4th of the Lincoln-Douglas debates in Charleston, Illinois, where he says, I have no intention of promoting social or political equality from blacks and whites. I'm not advocating for black people to hold office, serve on juries, to vote. I'm simply saying that when a black man earns by the sweat of his brow the bread that he's going to eat, he's got a right to put it in his mouth and not have to give it to someone else. And in that sense, Lincoln goes on to say, in that respect, in that natural right that he has to eat the bread that he's earned by the sweat of his brow, he is my equal, Judge Douglas is equal, and the equal of every living man. Now, many people afterwards say, well, that's not much equality, is it? Understand 2 things. One is, Lincoln there, yes, is talking about natural equality. That's not because he doesn't believe that there are certain categories of civic and political equality. It's that in the 19th century, it was widely understood that these are 2 different categories. Slavery, however, is built on the idea, not just that you deny equality in one category, but that you deny it in both. And no one saw where Lincoln was going with this more clearly than Stephen A. Douglas, his opponent, because Douglas will stand up right after Lincoln and say, when Lincoln talks to you about this natural equality between black and white, don't listen to him. Because as soon as you agree with that, you're on the high road to civic and political equality. And for once in his life, Stephen A. Douglas was right. That is, in fact, where that was going to take things. And in the distance, in the just 7 years between that debate in Illinois and what Lincoln is advocating in 1865, he has moved along exactly those lines. You start with the natural equality of all human beings described in the Declaration, and ineluctably, you are going to be drawn into that next category of civic and social equality. It's going to happen. And the remarkable thing is, the war is the catalyst for that. It's the catalyst for it because war tends to be a catalyst for social change anyway. But it's especially a catalyst because of the black soldier. Lincoln always had a vivid sense of personal obligation. And when his feeling is when you call upon black Americans to enlist, to wear the blue uniform, to fight under the stars and stripes, then As he says in the Conkling letter in September of 1863, if you're going to do that, everyone functions. Every human being functions on the basis of self-interest. If you want black people to fight for you and win this war, then you're going to have to give them something too. And for him, that something eventually is going to wind up with civic and political equality. And by the last weeks of the war, by the last months of the war, that is what he is talking about. Just 7 years.
Much would you say the American but British drive towards voting rights for women after they volunteered and did so much to aid the war effort, the Great War effort? Like, well, hey, we've done our bit. We've earned this.
And not only votes for women in Britain, and then, of course, in America as well. But in fact, in Britain, a dramatic expansion of the voting franchise for everybody. We don't often appreciate how limited voting rights were in Britain, even up through the 19th century, even after the Great Reform Act of 1832, even after expansion. There are actually 3 major reform acts. Each of them does a little tweak. Each expands the franchise a little bit more. It's really not until 1918 that, as a result of having called these millions of people into the service of the British Empire, that the sense of the British government is, we're going to have, it's payback time. We are going to have to compensate. And the compensation is going to have to come in the form of the expansion of the franchise. That's what happens for both men and women in Britain at the close of the First World War.
Yeah, the so-called age of improvement of the late 19th century. It's aptly named in some ways and not in others. You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Allen Guelzo. We're discussing his brilliant new book, which I have to say, I did read some pages more than once just to make sure that I understood what you were saying. That's a compliment to you, not anything else. Because
I hope I was not being dense.
It was not being dense. It was if you were my political candidate, I would spin it and say you're being profound, not dense.
It's a very concentrated book.
Oh, it is, but you have to have. I would say this, and this isn't a criticism, of course, but don't make this the first book you ever read on Abraham Lincoln.
No.
There are several books that are amazing, but when you feel like you understand a little bit more of the man, the times, his mind, who he surrounded himself with, the cause, this book is an excellent way to bring all those together. You were talking about a few minutes ago, and it led me to this next question I was going to ask anyway, but it's perfect segue. Well, Stephen Douglas, the senator who ended up being a Democrat nominee for president in 1860, knew where Lincoln was going. Who else, perhaps on that team of rivals, understood what Lincoln was saying and what his goals were? I'm a huge fan of Secretary of State Seward, who I think recognized Lincoln's genius. Despite Seward's best efforts at the beginning, he recognized Lincoln's genius. The best of us all, I think, is what he said. He is the best of us all. Did any contemporary understand where Lincoln was going and Lincoln felt a kindred spirit?
It's difficult to say because Lincoln does not open himself up easily to other people. He doesn't have a circle of confidants. There are friends of his that he uses during the war years to act on embassy. And I don't mean embassy in the sense of a formal diplomat. Sure. If he's anxious, let's say, about popular opinion in Indiana, he will call on one of his old friends from Illinois and say, would you go over into Indiana and talk to people there and then report back and give me a sense of what popular opinion seems to be moving toward. But decision-making, he doesn't have a circle of people that he draws in that way. Even his cabinet. And this is one point in which he doesn't, in fact, have a team of rivals. They're not even close to being his rivals. And they know it from the way he treats them. One of the curious things about the presidential cabinet was that from the time of Washington up until the election of Lincoln, the presidential cabinet had actually been doing a kind of bracket creep in terms of its authority, its independence, its sense of itself, to the point where in the 1850s, when Jefferson Davis is Secretary of War under Franklin Pierce, Davis is almost acting like an independent figure in the Pierce administration. It's almost becoming something similar to British cabinet ministries, where you do, in fact, have what amount to fiefdoms that are responsible directly to Parliament. Lincoln ends that at once. Lincoln makes it clear from day one, not just with Seward, but with every member of the cabinet, that they are there to do his bidding. He yanks Seward's chain the most publicly, but he actually does it with all of them. And no one resents it more than Salmon Chase, the Secretary of the Treasury, because Chase had visions that he was somehow better than Lincoln, that it was only an accident that Lincoln was the president rather than Salmon Chase. And of course, Chase is going to spend a substantial amount of time leading up to 1864 trying to position himself for a dump Lincoln movement. Correct. And Chase writes in his diary, he's very frustrated. He says, Lincoln doesn't consult us for our opinions. Lincoln just treats us as heads of departments, that we're just there, he's going to give us orders, and we're going to execute them. And Chase thought that was scandalous. What Lincoln does is to establish a pattern of relationship between the presidential cabinet and the president, which we inherit to this day. So Lincoln really is a hinge, not because he's got a team of rivals, but because it puts an end to the idea that there is a team of rivals in the cabinet. He is going to run the show, so much so that in 1863, John Hay, this young whippersnapper out of Brown University, whom he hires as a secretary, Hay writes in his diary, and in a letter that he writes to John Nicolay, too, and he says, I never knew until now with what authority the tycoon, that was his phrase.
I love that name.
Tycoon.
The tycoon.
He abbreviates it to the T. All right. I never understood till now with what authority the T governs. He controls the cabinet. He controls conscription. He controls the war effort. He does it all. He is like some backwoods Jupiter throwing his thunderbolts. And then Hay adds, there is none so good and kind as he. I believe that God has put him in this place. And when you reflect on how readily a great man does not look all that great to his valet,
sure,
here you get the exact opposite with John Hay. John Hay, who has all these ambitions to be a great literary figure, who will in fact go on to be a famous writer. He'll be Secretary of State under Theodore Roosevelt. He just gets more and more lost in admiration for Lincoln. It's really a remarkable statement by Hay.
We have a few minutes left on the Leaders and Legends podcast with Professor Allen Guelzo. Let me throw out another name to see your thoughts on this regarding an understanding of where Lincoln was heading. Frederick Douglass. Do you get the sense that Douglass had the hope or the foresight to see Lincoln's ultimate journey with regard to the freedmen and slavery?
That's difficult to discern. But what is easier to see is how much Douglass changes in his own perception of Lincoln. When Lincoln is elected, Douglass is not happy. Douglass is not in a good mood anyway in 1860, because by 1860, it looked like the anti-slavery cause was lost. Not only the Kansas-Nebraska Act, but then the Dred Scott decision in 1857. This just looked like the whole country was moving wholesale to the approval and the approbation of slavery. There was, in fact, a case working its way up through the federal judiciary, Lemon versus New York, which, if it had come before the United States Supreme Court, would have struck down the free state statutes banning slavery in those states. And Douglass looks at this and says, we have tried, we have testified against, we have labored against, I have lectured against slavery all these many years, and what do we have to show for it? Nothing. In fact, it's gotten worse. And at that moment, Douglass was actually tempted to emigrate to Haiti. because he just saw no future that way. And when Lincoln becomes president, he's not really enchanted by what he hears Lincoln say. When he hears Lincoln in his speeches, when he hears Lincoln in his first inaugural saying, I've got no intention of meddling with slavery in the states where it's legal, what he hears is the voice of someone who doesn't really have a backbone. And so he's critical of Lincoln. And he's critical at a number of points. When Lincoln brings a delegation, Black leaders from Washington, D.C. to the White House in August of 1862, Lincoln gives them this long-winded speech about how they ought to be willing to support colonization before emancipation. And Douglas erupts. He says, here's the President of the United States behaving like an itinerant colonization lecturer. And then comes the Emancipation Proclamation, which, curiously enough, even while Lincoln was talking about colonization, he had the Emancipation Proclamation sitting in his desk. Why is he talking about colonization? You know what he's doing? He's sugarcoating the pill of emancipation, because he knows this is a nation, even in the North, which is still predominantly white supremacist.
And Illinois was particularly bad.
Oh, especially bad. How is he going to buy cooperation with his Emancipation Proclamation? By talking a lot about colonization. That'll make the pill go down more easily. Douglas is not privy to all of this, but when the Emancipation Proclamation, in fact, is issued and becomes a legal ruling on January 1st, 1863, then Douglas starts to pay attention to Lincoln. And in August of 1863, he makes his first journey to the White House for an interview with Lincoln. And he comes away from it astonished. He says afterwards to John Eaton, I was talked to as one gentleman would talk to another. He'd never been talked that way. He'd never been talked like that by other white people. Even abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison had been tempted to treat Douglas as, well, a tool in their own strategies.
Mm.
And Douglas will meet with Lincoln again. He will say years afterwards that Lincoln was the first great man he had ever met in America, which didn't remind him, which didn't poke him about their difference in terms of color. And he will say in a eulogy that he delivers at the Cooper Institute after Lincoln's death that Abraham Lincoln was preeminently the colored man's president. He will develop an understanding of Lincoln in which he begins to see Abraham Lincoln as, in a lot of ways, very similar to himself. He says in the memoir he writes, this brief memoir he writes of meeting with Lincoln, he said the reason Lincoln didn't dwell on the difference of color was because Lincoln saw in Douglas what Lincoln had seen in himself, someone who started out at on the very bottom rung of the social and economic ladder, and who, by labor, by intelligence, by application, by diligence, had made something of themselves. Douglas will give a lecture. Oh, he gives it actually more than 200 times in his career. It's a lecture called Self-Made Men. And yes, to a certain degree, Douglas is talking about himself as a self-made man, and he'd earned that. But his preeminent example of a self-made man is Abraham Lincoln. So Douglas believes over time that he has discerned in Lincoln someone not all that unalike from himself. And that is a remarkable change in its own right, because it's not only Douglas as a black man who is invited to the White House. There's a whole galaxy of prominent black Americans who pay these visits to Lincoln and the White House. Sojourner Truth, prominent black clergy, Henry McNeil Turner. And they all come away impressed by Lincoln, to the point where by 1864, black Sunday school associations are holding their fundraising picnics on the White House lawn. Before 1860, who could ever have imagined a white president in a white republic treating black Americans that way? So Lincoln doesn't draw attention to himself for doing that. He's very subtle. He has this very back kitchen way of doing things, as Benjamin Wade once said. But he sends the message all the same. We are now moving into a different era. And it is a different era, not because we've broken with the past, but because we have finally understood how to realize the past. We are having a new birth of freedom. And Rick Brookhiser, I think, captures this perfectly when he says that at Gettysburg, Lincoln didn't talk about a birth of new freedom, as though we were going to be entirely different from the past. No, we are talking about a new birth, a renovation, a rediscovery of the principles that originally animated the American democracy. And if there's anything that I think we need to hear today, it is from the example of Lincoln teaching us, come back to democracy, come back to the ideas of the Republic, wash those robes in the principles of democracy, especially our ancient faith.
Professor Allen Guelzo discussing his latest book, Our Ancient Faith, Lincoln, Democracy, and the American Experiment. And you were very kind at the beginning of this podcast to let me mention Gettysburg, and I'll do it in this vein, no pun intended. I was very good friends with the deceased, brilliant, unbelievable man. I'm very lucky to have his friendship. Andrew Jacobs, who was on the Lincoln Bicentennial Commission. And the only argument he and I ever got into, that was like a real argument, was his contention that Mary Surratt was completely innocent and was unfairly executed. I remember just looking at him and started laughing. I'm like, you spent too much time in the cold in Korea there, Andy. I said, you got to be kidding me.
I will say this without the slightest tincture of flattery, that my opinion tends to lean in your direction. I think it is impossible for me to imagine that she did not know what was going on.
The second great man great Hoosier, to whom I expressed a perhaps controversial Civil War opinion, was history buff extraordinaire and former Governor Mitch Daniels. I'm guessing
I know of him. I don't believe we've ever met or spoken or anything like that. But I know the names of some governors. I'll say
he came on the podcast. Excuse me.
I probably know the names of more Civil War era governors than I know of modern governors.
Actually, it's funny because I introduced Mitch Daniels at an event one time, and I called him the greatest governor in Indiana history, save for Oliver P. Morton. And I asserted to Mitch Daniels in a podcast interview that the Battle of Gettysburg was severely overrated. And he looked at me with a visage of disdain, disappointment, little disgust. I just don't understand. I do understand, but I feel Shiloh is the most important battle of the war, and Gettysburg is the most romanced battle of the war. You wrote a book on Gettysburg. How wrong am I?
I'm not sure how possible it is to do rankings that way. Certainly, Gettysburg's been written about more than any of the other battles of the Civil War. It was a long battle, 3 days. Shiloh was 2, but Gettysburg is 3. Casualties are enormous. The consequences are enormous, probably more enormous than Shiloh. So I would say, yes, there's some argument for saying that Gettysburg perhaps should outrank Shiloh. But I would also put in a plea for Antietam. And I think Antietam has sometimes been the poor relation of Civil War military history. Antietam and the campaign in Maryland in the fall of 1862 is the event in the Civil War that we think we know all about. I think we know a whole lot less about it than we imagine. And the literature on Antietam has been so much thinner than that of either Gettysburg or Shiloh. But you want to talk about consequences? All right, granted, Lincoln does not go to Antietam afterwards and deliver a memorable address. But he does write a document that he could only have written because of what happened at Antietam, and that was the Emancipation Proclamation. And I suppose you might say that the Emancipation Proclamation is Lincoln's Antietam address. And that is the single greatest change or game changer of the Civil War, maybe the single greatest pronouncement by an American president in American history. Perhaps rather than worrying about Gettysburg and Shiloh, I would suggest that we might devote some more attention and some more seriousness to understanding what happens in the fall of 1862 in Western Maryland.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today has been Professor Allen Guelzo. We discussed his new book, Our Ancient Faith, Lincoln, Democracy, and the American Experiment. Professor Guelzo, this is the second time you've been on the podcast. I'm very grateful for your time. Your books are wonderful. Thank you so much, and please come back on again one other time, or as often as you like.
Thank you, and I just might take you up on that.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.